one of our first tests, Senator Shaheen, is going to be in Syria. We don't have an embassy in Syria. It's operating out of Turkey. But we need to help them. We want to help that government succeed because the alternative is full-scale civil war and chaos, which would, of course, destabilize the entire region. And we are going to allow our people on the ground, both our embassy personnel at the Damascus embassy located in Turkey and for the short period of time, at least or in the interim, our ambassador in Turkey, to work with local officials there to make determinations about what kind of aid they need. Is it humanitarian? Is it improving law enforcement or governance functions? We think it's going to be the first test of this new model, but I strongly believe that our decisions and the power to drive decisions and the decisions and the inputs that we're taking have to be driven in many cases from the bottom up, not from the top down, and focused on the fact that there is unique sets of factors in individual parts of the world that require different priorities and attention. And ultimately, foreign policy, mature foreign policy, requires a balancing of interests. That's just a fact. Yeah, well, it's entirely driven by security concerns. By the way, it's not the transitional authorities. We don't think they would harm us, but there are other elements on the ground in Syria that we have to be able to protect our people. Point. And there are the ability, you don't just have to be able to get people in, you have to be able to get people out. We have all kinds of requirements that are there for a reason. If someone is hurt, do you have a medical evacuation plan? Can you secure a facility from an attack from an armed group, many of whom are still running loose in the country, unfortunately? It's one of the fundamental challenges the transitional authority is facing. On the broader point of Syria, I would say when Syria, if you look at the history of the region, when Syria is unstable, the region becomes unstable. And this has certainly been true after the Arab Spring led to the Assad rebellion against Assad, and that really destabilized the entire region. And then it turned Syria, frankly, into a playground for jihadist groups, including ISIS and others, that used it to operate and to destabilize their partners. So you have this change in December. And my view, which I've discussed with many of you individually, is the bad news is that the transitional authority figures, they didn't pass their background check with the FBI. Okay? They've got a tough history and one that we understand. But on the flip side of it is, if we engage them, it may work out, it may not work out. If we did not engage them, it was guaranteed to not work out. In fact, it is our assessment that, frankly, the transitional authority, given the challenges they're facing, are maybe weeks, not many months, away from potential collapse and a full-scale civil war of epic proportions, basically the country splitting up. The good news is that there is a Syrian national identity. It is one of the places in the Middle East where Alawis and Druze and Christians and Sunni and Shia have lived and Kurds have lived alongside each other underneath the banner of a Syrian identity until it was broken by a butcher, Assad, who pitted them against each other. So they face a number of challenges. The first is they are dealing with deep internal distrust in that country because Assad deliberately pitted these groups against each other. He claimed to be the protector of the Alawis and the Christians and pitted them against the Druze or whoever else he wanted to, and the result is a deep level of distrust. The second is the displacement, upwards of 6, 7, 8 million Syrians living abroad, very successful, by the way, in the countries they go to. But we need to figure out how we can enable the transitional authority to create an environment where they come back home, where they can come back to their homes, where they can help rebuild their economy. But what prompted the president to move quickly on sanctions? Because we had a plan. We engaged with the foreign minister at the UN here in New York. We gave him a visa to come into the country. We allowed their finance minister to come to World Bank meetings here in Washington, D.C. The next step was I was going to meet with the foreign minister, and some of you may have met with him already at Munich, but I was going to meet with him in Turkey at the NATO gathering. But the president had an opportunity to meet with al-Shara. And frankly, he made a bold decision. I'll do it. I'll meet with them under the Saudis and the Turks that encourage that. And the rationale and the reason is we need to, right now, the most important thing is that partnering nations, the nations in the region want to get aid in, want to start helping them. And they can't because they're afraid of our sanctions. So they don't. The lifting of the sanctions, its most immediate impact will be to allow neighboring countries to begin to assist the transitional authority to build governance mechanisms that allow them to actually establish a government, unify the armed forces under one banner and the like. But I want to be frank, that won't be enough. With the Caesar Act, we can issue waivers, but these waivers, because of expirations on them, are not going to attract the kind of foreign investment. Ultimately, there's going to have to be something done congressionally or more comprehensively to ensure that if the right steps are taken, we can create an environment for private sector growth that begins to provide economic opportunity to the people of Syria. But one last point I would make is the outcome in Syria will have a deep impact on what happens inside of Lebanon. Because Lebanon, too, has been hurt by a combination of clashes at the border, but also they've had to assume responsibility for some of these Syrian refugees.
We believe that, by the way.
So the combination, if you think about a region let's say 2 years from now, where Syria and Lebanon are stable, that opens up incredible opportunities around the region for all kinds of peace and security and the end of conflicts and wars. Obviously, this is a big task. It's big picture thinking, but it's a historic opportunity and one that we are obligated to try to explore and see if we can make it work.
On Syria, I know that many of us are eager to work with you on implementing the president's plan to lift sanctions and protect key U.S. priorities. What assurances is the administration seeking in your discussions with interim authorities on counterterrorism priorities, including the fight against ISIS, during the process of lifting the sanctions?
Well, ISIS hates the transitional authority, and they hate al-Shara, and they hate everybody in his government, and I think pose a grave risk to them. So I don't think the issue with them right now is a matter of willingness or a lack of willingness. It's a lack of capability. So there will have to continue to be a role to play in the interim period, both by the United States and our allies and the Kurds and others, in ensuring that ISIS cannot metastasize and grow. One of the most threatening things that we would face, for example, is an ISIS prison break, where suddenly you have a bunch of ISIS fighters loose on the streets and undermining the government. But I do think that part of this dynamic and why we're in a race against time is that every day that goes by that the transitional authority does not have control of the government and or of daily life in some extent, or able to provide basic government services, is a day that ISIS has the ability to reconstitute itself and grow as a threat, both to the transitional authority but ultimately to the broader region. So I don't sense from them a lack of commitment and desire to do something about it. I think, frankly, it's at this moment a capacity issue. They simply, at this moment, do not have the capacity to assume the anti-ISIS effort by themselves. But we hope that with a fully integrated Syrian military that includes the Kurds and everybody else, if you can have no other armed groups in the country except those under the authority of the Syrian government, then I think you begin to make progress. But we're not there yet. That's going to take some time to build, and we look forward to helping as much as we can and as much as little as they want.
Along those same lines, as you know, Turkey has significant interest in Syria and has been, I think, an important part of the steps that have recently taken place. But our allies in Israel and Jordan are concerned about Ankara's ambitions there, especially in southern Syria. How are you managing those tensions and allied concerns as it relates to Turkey's role in Syria?
Well, in the case of Israel, we've had conversations with them about this, what we view as an opportunity for Israel. If, in fact, Syria is stable and has in it a government that has no interest, as they have said, in fighting a war with the authorities have said it. Now, obviously, you have to prove it, but they have said this is a nationalist project. They are seeking to build a nation. They're not viewing themselves as a launch pad for revolution. They're not viewing themselves as a launch pad for attacks against Israel. So we think this is an extraordinary thing. If, in fact, you have in Syria a stable government that encompasses all the elements of their society and has no interest whatsoever in fighting wars with Israel over borders or anything else, I think that's an extraordinary achievement for Israel's security. Obviously, they're concerned about the Turkish presence, and we've done some things to deconflict on that front. And I think one of the key points is going to be foreign military basing inside of Syria. And that is, at some point, the Transitional Authority will have to make a decision about whether they're going to allow foreign military basing. That includes Russians, but potentially the Turks have wanted that as well, especially in the central part of the country. Now, the Turks do have a presence in the north, as you know, and one of the things that our Central Command was very influential in doing is helping the Transitional Authority enter a preliminary agreement with Kurdish authorities in the north, which ultimately should lead to the Kurds becoming part of the broader Syrian government and broader security forces. And by the way, the Jordanians, despite concerns they may have been very helpful and very encouraging in our outreach to the Transitional Authority.
I want to move to one of Iran's in the neighborhood neighbors with Syria. And President Trump met with the new Syrian president. He's urged the leader to deport foreign terrorists from Syria, help the U.S. counter ISIS. I want to just talk about ISIS, if I can, the concern for the resurgence of ISIS. It's been a significant concern. About 2,500 active ISIS fighters operating in Syria and in Iraq. Estimated 10,000 ISIS fighters in prisons in Syria. And what's your assessment of the threat posed in ISIS? And I know we have a presence. I was visiting our Wyoming troops who are in eastern Syria, and I want to know how that's helped to address the threats.
Yeah, so there's two major threats facing the Transitional Authority in Syria. The first is a resurgence of ISIS many of them foreign fighters, most of them foreign fighters, and that's a very significant element because any space that's ungoverned, if there are parts of the country where the transitional authority does not control it, it creates an ungoverned space that ISIS can come in. So that's the first threat. The other is Iran. Iran has not given up its efforts to gin up former Assad officials and others to get behind certain armed groups on the ground and stir up trouble as well in the country. So these are both threats. They're different, but they're related, and they pose two of the most serious threats to the transitional authorities' efforts to create a nation state in in Syria that does not threaten Israel, does not threaten its neighbors, and is able to provide the life that the people of Syria want to rebuild for themselves, including many who are abroad, who have expressed a willingness or an interest in returning. And in fact, we've seen some of those people begin to return just because of the U.S. sanctions announcement. But we want that trend to continue because Syria will need them in order to rebuild their country and reclaim it.